Delighted to have you here. Welcome back to VBS College of Jewish Studies. For those of you who have never been, it's a delight to have you here. We offer, you can't hear? You really can't hear? Rigo, can we get a little more juice? Up. Turn it up. Thank you, sir. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Better? Is that better? I get too loud? I want all the people who think that the mic's too loud and the room's too cold to move to this side. Satisfy these Jews, my God. My God. It's a good thing Messiah's coming. We offer college-level learning for adults in the community without football sororities or quizzes. A chance to grow as a human being, as a citizen, as a Jew. And we're delighted that you're all here with us. If you're a member of VBS, it's damn good to see you. If you're a member of another congregation, a community, we're delighted you've come, and we hope that you'll return many, many times and feel at home here. If you're not a member of a synagogue, we would be delighted to have you join this one. The gentleman in the back in the Cubs jacket, stand up. This is Scott, who's the president of the shul. Scott has waited 108 years to wear that jacket. It's very rare to find a Cubs fan who's actually proud. And finally, he can be proud. So Scott would be delighted to welcome you to the synagogue, make you part of our community, and make you feel like all of this is yours, and I'd be delighted as well. So we're really glad you're here. A couple of quick announcements before we begin our presentation. Tonight we'll welcome our guest. Hope that you'll stay through the end of the program. We're going to hear from our guest, take a few minutes break in the middle, and then return for conversation, for some questions and some answers. Friday night is the first of our Farbrengen series. About once a month, Cantor Fox offers a series on Jewish culture. Given the nature of the times, Friday night's Jewish comedy night. You could use some laughter. So we'll start at 8 o'clock with a very brief service. Those who need to say Kaddish will be saying the Kaddish, and then we'll pick up the prayer books, and we have Rabbi Jerry Cutler coming, who's a very funny storyteller and a wonderful, wonderful comedian. And Mike Preminger is an old friend who's going to be coming back. And Herschel and I get to pretend we're comedians, which is a great joy for us. So please join us Friday night at 8 o'clock. Shabbos morning at 9 o'clock, of course, there's Torah study like every week. At 9:30, the VBS Neshama Minyan meets. It's a wonderful musical minyan led by my wife. You will do my marriage good if you show up. And when you show up, say, I heard about it at College of Jewish Studies. I'm here for you, Nina. It will help me a lot. It's a beautiful minyan. The truth is, it's a beautiful minyan. And Nina's going to be talking about women and power, specifically the images in the Bible about how women control history in the Bible. It's a wonderful conversation, a beautiful service. That's at Shabbos, about 9:30, 10 o'clock. You're all welcome for that. Next week, we will have College of Jewish Studies on Monday. Go ahead, ask me why it's on Monday. Because Wednesday's Erev Yontif, that's why. Wednesday is going to be Erev Yontif, and it's Thanksgiving. So what Yontif is it? It's Thanksgiving. You're home with a butterball in the oven, right? So please, Wednesday night, take the time to be with your family and friends and give thanks for the goodness that God has given us. We're a conservative synagogue, so we celebrate Thanksgiving Thursday and Friday. So just be sure of that, okay? Instead, next week's College of Jewish Studies will be on Monday night. We are doing this, it's part of our APAC program. We're going to share it with APAC, and our guest brought to us by APAC is the journalist and scholar Khalid Abu Tomeh, who is a Palestinian Israeli, who's going to be talking about his vision of the Middle East and the state of Israel and the Palestinian and Israeli narratives and how they clash and where they have overlap. It's a very, very insightful fellow, and I want you to come and hear him. It's Monday night at 7:30 or o'clock? 7, I think it's at 7. Come early, you'll get a seat if it's at 7, okay? And then the following week, we return back to Wednesday night, and more about that later. Later in the semester, we're going to have Daniel Levy, who's the new head of the Middle East Institute, and we're going to have Peter Beinart, one of the great journalists, and we're going to have Tal Becker, who is the chief negotiator for the Israeli Foreign Ministry. They're all our guests as part of the College of Jewish Studies, which is free and offered through the good courtesy and generosity of our dear friends Jess and Lil Baim, and we wish Jess a soon recovery and strength, and return to us very, very soon. That's all the announcements, unless you can think of anything else. Let's ask everybody to stand from your seats Turn about and say hello to the people behind you and in front of you and around you. Wish them a good evening and welcome. Now don't sit down, but put your arms around your friends next to you and bring them close. Bring them close. Bring them close. We offer a prayer for the chance to learn Torah together. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddishanu mitzvotav etzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Yaseh shalom, yaseh shalom. Shalom Aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, yaseh shalom. Shalom Aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, yaseh shalom. Shalom Aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, yaseh shalom. Shalom Aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, yaseh shalom. Shalom Aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Please be seated. Please be seated. Please be seated. Our guest tonight is Dr. Joshua Moravchik, and we'd like to also welcome his wife Sally in the back. They have 3 wonderful daughters, 8 grandchildren, 7 grandsons and a granddaughter. So they came out to see the kids. And while they were out, we were delighted to invite Dr. Moravchik to come in to speak to us. He holds many different posts and titles in the world of intellectual diplomacy, including a position at the Johns Hopkins School and the World Affairs Council. And he's the author of a number of books, but tonight he's going to talk about this one, which you can take home with you before it's made into a major Hollywood movie. And the book is called Making David into Goliath, How the World Turned Against Israel. And here's the thesis of the book. We're talking about Israel since 1967 in our series, these 50 years. In 1967, the whole world was proud of Israel. In 1967, even the United Nations was proud of Israel. In 1967, Zionism was recognized as a leading liberation movement in the world. That's not true anymore. Today, if you are called a Zionist, especially on an American college campus, it's a curse. Today, Israel doesn't stand a chance. Today, UNESCO voted that Jews have no stake in Jerusalem. The world has turned against Israel. How that happened, why that happened, and what we can do about it is the thesis of this very fine book. And tonight we're proud to bring him here to talk to us. Please welcome Dr. Joshua Moravchik. How the world turned against Moravchik. That's
all right, like this. Okay. Again, it's good. I don't know if I can see my notes over the mic in my face, but thank you very much, Rabbi, and thank you all for honoring me by being here to listen to me. And it's a joy to be out here in this magnificent shul. We have, as the Rabbi said, we have a daughter and husband and grandchildren who live, 40 miles from here in Claremont, California, and there are more or less no shuls, no Jews, so it's wonderful to come here and see all of this and all of you. So the rabbi, in introducing me, stated the question that I tried to address in this book I've written, and I'll try to address in the talk I'll give you tonight, and that is what happened that brought about such a dramatic change from 1967, when Israel was viewed with a lot of support and sympathy in the world to today, when Israel is often treated as a pariah nation. And I would say, broadly speaking, three different things happened. The first thing that happened was that the '67 war in itself brought about tremendous change in circumstance. Up until then, and particularly on the eve of the '67 war, Israel seemed terribly vulnerable and endangered. And after it won that smashing victory in 6 days in 1967, it was never again to seem so vulnerable and endangered. Rather, it seemed like a powerhouse in the Middle East. Secondly, at the end of the war, Israel ended up occupying territory that it hadn't when the war broke out in the West Bank and Gaza and the Golan. But the West Bank and Gaza were the really significant ones in one respect, and that is that they soon created an issue of conflict with emergent Palestinian nationalism. In fact, Palestinian nationalism was really born as a result of the Six-Day War. It had not existed before then. I can see that there are some people in this room who are as old as I am, and so if you think back to that era of the 1960s and before, the hot idea in the Arab world was pan-Arabism. It had sort of the sex appeal that in the current era Islamism has in that part of the world. But in the 50s and 60s, pan-Arabism was the big idea. Pan-Arabism meant that all of the Arabs should be joined together in one omnibus state, which would be a huge state and would make the Arabs great and powerful again. And the main advocate of that idea was President Nasser of Egypt. And he spoke about it and wrote about it. And by the way, he was not at all shy or modest in saying in his writings who it was who he thought should be the head of that state. And it was he who really brought about the Six-Day War, and it destroyed his prestige. This was going to be the glorious moment for the Arabs, and instead it turned into their greatest humiliation. And Nasser was humiliated. You may recall he offered his resignation at that moment, although he was persuaded to withdraw it. But even though he remained in power, his prestige was gone, and all the air went out of the balloon of this idea of pan-Arabism. And the significance of that was that it made space, so to speak, for reassertions of nationalist feelings in individual Arab countries, but in particular, it cleared the field for the rise of Palestinian nationalism, which just had not existed before. There was such a thing as the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, which had been founded in 1964, not by Palestinians, but by Nasser. And the point of it was not to assert the national identity of Palestinians, but rather within the context of pan-Arabism to liberate the territory of Palestine from the Jews so that it could take its rightful place as part of this overall omnibus Arab nation. The head of the PLO, and when it was originally founded, was appointed by Nasser, And there is nothing in the founding constitution of the PLO that asserted anything about an independent Palestinian people, an independent Palestinian state. The idea of Palestinians as a people, as a nationality, was thrown up over the years here and there by a miscellaneous Palestinian writer or something, but never had any traction until after 1967, in the wake of this terrible defeat for Pan-Arabism. And then there was this one little group in Kuwait known as Fatah, which was led by Yasser Arafat, and who had a following of just a handful of people. And Arafat was really the founder of this idea that the Palestinians are a people. They should have some kind of nation of their own. They were so marginalized initially that Fatah and these guys were not members, were not a part of the PLO. But after '67, when everything was shaken up, they moved into the PLO, they took it over, and pretty soon Arafat was the head of the PLO, and they started expounding this idea that the Palestinians are a people, they're a nation, they should have self-determination of their own, and they managed to put this idea before the eyes of the world, mostly by carrying out spectacular deeds of terrorism, which drew everyone's attention, and they put across this idea that the Palestinians were a nation, a distinct people, and that their independence was blocked by Israel, which was occupying them and denying them self-determination, which they were entitled to like all other peoples. So there was a sudden change, whereas until this point of 1967, everyone understood, because it was stated quite plainly, that the essence of the conflict between Israel and its neighbors was that the Arabs wanted to deny to the Jews a state of their own, and suddenly now it was the Jews who were denying to someone else, namely this newly founded Palestinian people, a state of their own. So that created a radical change in some of the dynamics. But still, even though Israel then was seen as an occupier or as thwarting the national aspirations of the Palestinian people, that in itself is not enough to explain why the world turned so dramatically against Israel. Because in other places in the world, there are other occupations, and there are other people who have national aspirations that are denied, and no one seems to get worked up about it the way so many seem to get worked up about the alleged sins of Israel. For example, the rabbi alluded to things that go on college campuses, but when was the last time you saw or read about an angry militant demonstration on some university campus against the occupation of Tibet? I haven't. And yet Tibet is occupied far longer and far more brutally than Palestine. And in fact, if Beijing would ever offer to Tibet some kind of compromise equivalent to what Israel has more than once offered to the Palestinians, the Dalai Lama would dance for joy. But it hasn't happened, and there's no chance that it's going to happen. Or you might consider the situation of the Kurds. The Kurds are another Middle Eastern people who desperately want a state of their own and have none. With all due respect for Palestinian nationalism, it's a new idea of the last 50 years. The Kurdish sense of nationhood goes back 1,000 years. There are 5 or 6 times as many Kurds as there are Palestinians. The Kurds have this 1,000-year-old nationality. They have their own language. They have their own culture and history. And they dearly want a state of their own, and it was denied to them when the Middle East was carved up at the end of World War I. It's denied to them to this day. And nobody except the Kurds themselves seems to be troubled by it. The way people are desperately troubled that the Palestinians are unable to have a nation of their own. And so, although we can say that there are these realities on the ground that were different after 1967 than before, they simply don't suffice to explain all of the anger we see toward Israel and all of the unwillingness to empathically understand Israel's situation. So we have to look beyond that for the explanation. And I think there are 2 others that are that do give us an understanding of what's happened. On the one hand, of these 2, on the one hand, there have been a lot of pressures brought to bear successfully by the Arabs that has changed the position of many countries and many individuals. And then secondly, there's been a broader intellectual shift in the post-World War II, or ever since World War II, in the way the world thinks about social justice, that this is not specific to the Middle East or to Israel and the Arabs, but it has had powerful consequences for the way the world has looked upon the Middle East conflict. Let me take each of these 2 broad factors in order. First, about the pressure that has been brought to bear. There have been several different kinds of this pressure. I mentioned a moment ago that the Palestinians put their claims or their issue on the world stage by spectacular acts of terror. And these acts of terror were very repugnant, but rather than repulsing people, they mostly had the effect of intimidating people. And they brought about a reaction of a kind of appeasement that particularly less in the United States, but very much so in Europe, in other parts of the world, Japan, and among the moderate Arabs as well. That is, people were afraid of these terrorists. Most of you in this room can recall, as I can, the most dramatic and in many ways most horrible of these acts of international terrorism was the attack on the Israeli athletes at the Munich Olympics, 1972. I'm sure people remember it. Do you remember that some of the terrorist group that carried this out were killed in a shootout at the end of the episode, but others were taken into custody by German police. And do you remember what happened to them? They were all released within a few months. And they were released because the German government felt itself to be intimidated by the terrorist group. They were afraid if they held these terrorists, these murderers, in a German jail, that there would be more terror attacks aimed at Germany to try to get their release. By the end of the 70s, the Israeli Foreign Ministry did a count that showed that in that decade, 204 individuals had been taken into custody in the course of terrorist attacks, and of those, 201 had been released because so much of the world was just intimidated by the terrorists, and the governments, particularly European governments, as well as some of the moderate Arab governments, were quite open about saying, we have to adjust our policies because we don't want to be in conflict with these people. And that was then reinforced in that same era by the Arab oil boycott at the time of the Yom Kippur War, which really had the effect of bringing Europe and Japan, which is also even a bigger oil importer, to their knees. And it was illustrated by something that Henry Kissinger wrote in his memoirs. He was particularly alarmed. This was going a year later when the war was over, the boycott was over, but he was alarmed that these oil exporting states had the power to bring the West to its knees in that way. And he thought that this was a terrible vulnerability in our national security. And so he proposed that the NATO countries get together with some kind of counter threat that would have the effect of making the oil exporters be afraid to use this weapon again. And he went and did a trip around Europe to the governments of our main allies, and he met a brick wall. And he wrote in his memoirs, and I quote here, "Every minister I consulted was terrified of possible confrontation with the oil producers." And so he just gave up the effort. And what happened there, especially in Europe and several other important countries, was between the terrorism and the oil blackmail, they just decided to shift their Middle East policies away from friendliness toward Israel to embracing the Arabs and in particular embracing the Palestinians, bringing Arafat into their international meetings and treating him like a head of state, etc. And finally, in terms of the kind of pressure that was mobilized by the Arab side, was just their tremendous advantage in numbers. The Arabs always had a tremendous numerical advantage, right? There's one state of Israel, there are 22 states that are members of the Arab League. There are 57 states that are members of the Islamic, it's called the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which is the collection of Muslim states. And for every Jew in the world, there are 100 Muslims in the world. The numbers are quite overwhelming, and those numbers translate into tremendous economic leverage and even more so diplomatic leverage. Right? Here's a dispute. There's one person on this side and 100 on that side. And to take a stand on the side of the one, you have to be unusually brave and principled to do that. And there aren't many governments around the world that are brave and principled. And so this gets manifested most obviously in the United Nations, where all these governments meet together. And so with the almost absurd targeting of Israel in the United Nations, the rabbi mentioned the recent vote in UNESCO to deny that either Jews or Christians have any connection to Jerusalem. It's only a Muslim holy place. And if you look, for example, at the General Assembly of the United Nations, it passes all kinds of resolutions. Most of them are about issues, the environment or world trade or what have you, but some of them are about particular countries or particular conflicts or particular regions. And if you take the resolutions that are focused on particular places, 75% of those resolutions are devoted to chastising Israel. 25% devoted to all the issues among the world's 194 other countries. So it's tremendously one-sided, and it reflects the leverage of this great numerical advantage that the Arabs and the Muslims have. So these are the kinds of pressures that were brought to bear to move the world off its pro-Israel stand of once upon a time to what we live with today. And then I said there was one other kind of force at work, and this is a little more subtle, but it's no less important, and that is a big intellectual change since World War II. It's a change in the dominant idea of, or the dominant image of social justice in the world. Of course, everyone's for social justice, but what does it mean? Well, for hundreds of years, the dominant image of the way people thought about social justice had to do with economics. It was the poor against the rich. In Marxist terms, the workers against the capitalists or the owners of businesses. And of course, all good-hearted people identified with the poor against the rich. But after World War II, and over the last, whatever it's been, 70 years since then, something else came to the fore, and that was, instead of an economic conflict of nationalities or of races or of ethnicities. And this came about because of the sort of worldwide rebellion against colonialism after World War II. All of Africa and the Middle East and much of Asia had been ruled by Europeans for a great many years, and those peoples rose up and threw off the shackles of colonial rule, successfully demanded their independence. And this, I think, was also reinforced by a different thing, but that went on in the United States, and that was the glorious civil rights revolution that happened in the United States in the 1950s and 60s. And these things all got rolled together into a kind of image that the dramatic moral drama of our time was the struggle of what was called the rest against the West, or the people of color against the white people who were the ones on top and were oppressing them. And I think this struggle of the people of color against the white person, or the rest against the West, came to be more powerful and inspiring to people than the older image of the poor against the rich. And the consequence for the Middle East is, if you see the great moral drama of our time in these ethnic terms, And then you look at the Middle East, well, the Israelis are or appear to be, the white Westerners, and the Arabs, the Palestinians, appear as the oppressed people of color, the post-colonial people struggling for their day in the sun. And people naturally sympathize with the latter against the former. Now, and so people with a passion for social justice became champions of the Palestinians and blamers of Israel. Now, the strange thing about this is that if you look beyond the image of social justice to the substance, you get a very different picture. What do I mean by the substance? I mean, forget the sort of moral passion play, but let's try to think in sort of practical terms. What is the essence of social justice? And to my mind, it's the slogan of the French Revolution has never been improved upon. Liberté, égalité, fraternité, freedom, equality, and brotherhood as the essential components of social justice. And if you look to that substance, Israel's record is really quite magnificent, particularly compared to the people it's fighting against. Let's take them quickly one at a time. Freedom. Well, there's an organization you may or may not have heard of. It's a private organization called Freedom House. It's a kind of odd name. It was formed in the 1940s by Eleanor Roosevelt and some others. And the most important thing it does is measure in a very scholarly way the amount of freedom in every country of the world every year. It's constantly updating this. And a country that's completely free can get a score of 1, and a country that's the most dictatorial that you can get, it gets a score of 7. And then every nation is scored in this way. It can be 1, 1.5, 2, 2.5, 3, etc. So Israel, year after year, gets a score of 1.5. Almost perfectly free. The Arabs have an average score among them of 5.5, very far over in the direction of as unfree as you can get. The Palestinians, where they rule themselves, by the way, have a score of 6, which is even worse than the Arab average. And then, if we look at equality, that's a more complicated thing because there are many different kinds of equality. To the French revolutionists, equality meant social equality. Instead of the inherited status of at feudal times, that people were all equally citizens of the country. And if you think about social equality, and you think about Israel, I'm sure many of you here know Israel. I know of no other country where students address their professors and employees, their bosses, and soldiers, their officers, by first name. It's a simple reflection of the kind of spirit of social equality that permeates Israeli society. And then you can think about economic equality. Well, economists measure that by a kind of abstruse statistic called a Gini coefficient, which I can't explain to you because I don't completely understand it myself, but it's a measurement of income distribution in a population. And Israel's score in that sense is not spectacular. It's right in the middle of the pack of countries. But it is pretty remarkable if you think about one other thing, which is Israel, more than any other country in the world, is really a nation of immigrants. And immigrants are necessarily people who are low earners, at least when they start out. And you have here in your state a lot of immigrants, and they are, for the most part, on the lower end of the income scale. Well, if you look around the world, if you look at third world countries, the proportion of their population that are immigrants is nil, because nobody wants to go move to those poor places. If you look at Europe, where immigration is a neuralgic issue, the proportion of the population immigrants is 9%. The United States, where we've just had this election where the winning candidate made his biggest issue to be immigration, the proportion that are immigrants is 13%. If you look at Israel, the proportion of immigrants is more than 1/3. It's somewhere, according to the UN, it's 40%. Some Israeli sources have told me it's actually not that high, it's 30 something. But in other words, many times greater than any other country. And so if you take Israel's sort of middle of the pack score for income distribution and factor in that it's got such a large share of its population that are new arrivals, then the degree of equality in income distribution is really quite remarkable. Then you can talk about gender equality. And there's no place in the world where there's complete gender equality, but there are few places where there's as much gender equality as there is in Israel, in terms of the role of women in Israeli politics, in terms of the role of women in the Israeli military, and in terms of the earnings of women as compared to the earnings of men. And then the toughest thing may be, in terms of equality, may be the question of the relation of Jews to Arabs. There's a large portion of the Israeli citizenry, roughly 20%, that are Arabs, and they do not enjoy complete equality with Jews. They don't in terms of their socioeconomic status. They face prejudice, they face some discrimination. And yet, even if you look at the comparison of Arabs to Jews in Israel, the picture really compares pretty well with other countries. For example, if you take level of education, which is measured by how many years of schooling the average person achieves, and you look at Israeli Jews and Arabs, you see that Jews on the whole have 15% more years of education than Arabs in Israel. But if you compare Jews to Gentiles in the United States, you'll find that Jews have 40 or 50% on average more education than Gentiles in the United States. Jews have a tradition of getting high levels of education. The same thing is true for income. The income of Jews in Israel is higher than the income of Arabs in Israel. But if you look at other places around the world, the income of Jews is higher than the other people who live in those countries. If you look at countries where there are both Jewish and Arab populations, not Israel, but like in Europe or what have you, or the United States, the income level of Jews is much higher than the income level of Arabs. The disparity between Jews and Arabs in Israel is not greater, it tends to be lesser than the disparity between Jews and Arabs living together in almost any other country. So that really when you look at equality, Israel's record is not perfect, but you'd be hard put to find another country whose record was better. And then the third part of our French Revolution slogan is fraternité, brotherhood. And again here, I think Israel's record is really quite a remarkably good one. First of all, there's just the process of creating this nation by melding together Jews who had nothing in common, Jews from all different corners of the world, not just Ashkenazim and Sfardim or Mizrahim that we know, but also other groups of Jews, the Bukharan Jews from Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, what have you. There are 100,000 of them in Israel. No one is sure of their history, but their tradition has it that they're one of the lost tribes. And then there are about 125,000 Jews from Ethiopia. They too have an oral tradition that goes way back, that they're one of the lost tribes. And then subsequently there was another group called the B'nai Menashe, who are from India, of Tibetan or Burmese stock ethnically. And there are now 5,000 to 10,000 of them in Israel. And they too have an oral tradition that they're one of the lost tribes. So there were 10 lost tribes, that's 3 of them. It's very likely that the other 7 are going to show up and knock on Israel's door sometime in the coming years. So Israel has melded all of these people into a thriving nation, and then it has gone, I would say, pretty far in terms of success of making the Arabs of Israel part of that country. That's still a very problematic issue, but if you look around at minorities in the region, the contrast is dramatic. And if you look at various kinds of polls of the opinion of Israeli Arabs about Israel and about whether they want to be part of it going forward or not, the responses to these polls are very heartening. And then also in terms of the spirit of brotherhood in Israel, we have the fact that Israel is a giver of foreign aid. It's a recipient of foreign aid from the United States, for essentially military aid, but it's a donor of foreign aid, not in terms of cash, but in terms of Israelis who go to poorer countries. Once they used to go and teach agriculture, now it's more common that they go and teach medicine to people in third world countries, and also to bring them to Israel to study medicine. There's also the giving of medical care, giving of medical care, for example, to Palestinians. I'm not referring to the Arab Israelis. I'm referring to the Arabs of Gaza and the West Bank. Does anyone have any idea how many Palestinians now cross over into Israel each year to receive treatment at Israeli medical facilities? The number is now more than 100,000 a year. There only are a few million Palestinians. They can't get sick that much. But broadly, the Palestinians, when they have serious medical needs, they get a permit, they come into Israel, they get treated at Israeli hospitals. This includes regularly the relatives of the leaders of Hamas and not to mention Fatah. And also, in a similar vein, Israel set up a field hospital right across the border from Syria, where there's been that horrible civil war going on. And Israel provides free medical treatment to these Syrian fighters who are wounded and manage to get across the border, or sometimes their comrades dump them across the border, where Israeli ambulances pick them up and take them to hospitals. So, again, I'm sure it's not perfect, but if you compare it to other countries, Israel's record is really quite a noble one. So, in sum, if you look beyond the slogans of social justice to these concrete measures of freedom, equality, and brotherhood, Israel's record is really quite an admirable one. I find some people who are more critical of Israel than I am would say, well, that's all well and good, but what about peace? Why doesn't Israel make peace? And the simple answer to that is, it's not in Israel's power to make peace with the Palestinians, because the Palestinians have not made a decision that they want to have peace with Israel. At the conclusion of the Six-Day War, I think it was Moshe Dayan was quoted as saying he was waiting for a phone call from Cairo. Now that Israelis had beaten the Arabs, a phone call from Cairo meaning that the Arabs were ready to make peace. Well, he said Cairo because until that moment, Nasser was the leader of the whole Arab world. And so he spoke for the Arab world. A few years later, the phone call did come from Sadat, but at that point, Sadat represented only Egypt. And Egypt was kicked out of the Arab League for the crime of making peace with Israel. And Sadat, as soon as Sadat was offered peace, Israel made peace. Remember, there were settlements. There were settlements. I'm not talking about Gaza. There were settlements in the Sinai. And when the negotiations started, Israel hoped to keep those settlements, just a little bit of the land. And Sadat said, no way, every inch of Egyptian territory must be returned to us. And Israel said, okay, and there was peace. When Jordan was ready to make peace, there was peace. Israel tried very hard to make peace with Syria. Rabin offered to return the entire Golan to Syria in the 1990s. And the deal broke down because Hafez al-Assad, the ruler of Syria, wanted not only the whole Golan, but land beneath the Golan to the Kinneret, which would have made Syria kind of co-owner of the Kinneret with Israel, and Rabin said no to that, and then the negotiations got deadlocked. I think most Israelis are very glad, given what's going on in Syria today, that deal fell through, and that the Golan is not now part of that horrendous warfare going on in Syria. And Israel tried to make peace with the Palestinians. starting with Oslo in 93, but then we had the Camp David talks of Barak and Arafat, and Arafat said no deal there. And then a few months later, President Clinton offered the so-called Clinton parameters, which went much farther in meeting Palestinian demands. And Israel sort of clenched, but said okay. The Palestinians said no. And then in 2008, Olmert, after many, many meetings with Abbas, offered a deal that would have given a great many things to the Palestinians, including a sort of equal exchange of land and allowing a significant symbolic number of Palestinians to sort of return to Israel, and sharing of Jerusalem and so on. And Abbas said no, or to be precise, he said, "I'll get back to you later," and then never did. And so I hear so often people saying, "Why won't Israel make peace?" And the question always seems to me absurd, because Israel has tried at every turn to make peace, but tragically, as of yet, there's no one to make peace with, no one who wants to make peace on the other side. And so, but unfortunately, the overwhelming numbers on the other side, and I think that's probably the single most powerful factor. The overwhelming numbers on the other side, the Arabs were never able to translate that successfully into military advantage. Israel, although outnumbered, has now, at the time of 67 and ever since, kept the upper hand in terms of military strength. But over these 50 years, the Arabs have learned how to turn that numerical advantage into diplomatic strength and propaganda strength. And there are a great many people who want to be on the side of the winner, right? Our president-elect's, his worst epithet for anyone is to call them a loser, right? And it's a kind of common human thought or feeling. And Israel has not been a loser, but Israel is still the very little one against great numbers. And I think that is the core of what has happened that has turned the world so much against Israel, even though so much of the evidence that's available to the naked eye speaks in Israel's behalf. So thank you for listening. I think I'm going to have a little exchange with Rabbi Feinstein, and then I hope with many of you.
So we're going to take, in just a second, we're going to take a quick coffee break. There's some cookies and coffee, the restrooms outside, and flyers of all the programs the synagogue is offering. Here's the question we're going to ask Professor Ravchik when we get back. You ready? In history, Arabs were known as fierce fighters, and Jews were known as great arguers. So why is it that now, when it comes to Israel, Israel is winning the military war, but losing the war of words? That's what I want to know. We're going to come back and talk about that in about 5 minutes, so go get a coffee and come on back. Thanks so much. That was great. I'm going to ask you 3 questions. We'll talk about, as I look at the book, I want to talk about liberals and the Democratic Party independently. And I want to talk about college campuses and BDS. And I want to talk about this question about why Israel has been so inept in answering the question. And if we have time, I might want to raise Rachel Corrie as a case study of liberalism, radicalism, college kids. Positive about Israel. There are places where the so-called Middle East Studies Department is a den of jihad. Basically, it's a viciously anti-Israel organization. What happened to American college campuses? How did they become toxic to Israel?
Well, there are a few different parts to this that all fit together. The core of it is that the left of the political spectrum has become extremely anti-Israel. Why? It certainly doesn't need to be. In fact, it once was the reverse. If you think about 1948, when Israel was born, the creation, the founding, the recognition of the Jewish state was supported by virtually every faction on left of center, from liberals to socialists to communists, and the people who were most against the U.S. recognizing Jewish state were on the right side of the political spectrum. Today, for reasons that are A, complicated, and B, I don't completely understand, that's reversed. So the right of the spectrum is more likely to be friendly, and the left is very hostile. This, in part, is part of it has to do with what I spoke about this shifting paradigm or the shifting image of social justice, going from economically focused to ethnically focused. Part of it, though, is also a very conscientious strategy by Arafat and the PLO starting in the 1970s, and to connect their cause with the global left. And at that time, if you think back to the Vietnam War, and that around the world people were very against the United States, and there was a kind of romanticization of revolutionary movements in the world, both the Viet Cong in Vietnam, but also in Latin America and in Africa, and many places where communists or people of similar stripe had taken the leadership of the national movements for independence. And the Palestinians were actually tutored by the Algerians, who had fought a revolutionary war successfully against France, and the Algerians then connected them, literally connected them, so that Arafat went on these with his other top Fatah leaders, went on these long trips to Hanoi and then to Beijing, and in all of their propaganda, they would say over and over again, the Palestinian revolutionary movement. It was kind of odd use of the term revolution, right? But that Arafat always used it, because revolution usually means you're trying to just overthrow the government of a country you're part of, and that's not what they were trying to do. They were trying to do something very different, but in order to affirm their identity and to take on some of the aura of these revolutionary movements around the world that were very popular, they called themselves revolutionary. And if you go back and read their statements, they always say, we stand in line with the noble Vietnamese people and with the liberation of this country and that country. And they had a lot of success in identifying their cause, and that way it was something that was more popular, even though there were some among the Palestinians who were leftist, communists, and so on. There were others who were conservative, devout Muslims, and Arafat was in the middle between them. The leftist coloration was more a tactic than it flowed from any deep ideological belief about the way society ought to be organized. And we see, I think, a a reprise of that tactic today, when a lot of the protests and turmoil on campus are racially based. They're black and brown students protesting against different things that they feel are injustices or insensitivity to them, or right at this moment, a lot of protests against the election of Trump. And in every case, the Palestinians are part of the coalition. They're among the so-called POCs, the people of color, and this has proved to be a very effective tactic.
And where do you get, where was the BDS movement? Where did that come from? This idea that you could influence, I guess, first universities and then states,
Churches.
churches to divest from Israel as a tactic of protest.
Well, it was really someone's brainchild. I mean, there are two Palestinians, one in Chicago and one in Canada, who came up with this tactic. They're both, by the way, quite openly advocates of the elimination of Israel. They're people who denounce the idea of a two-state solution, but they say, well, in BDS we don't demand that. We just, personally, we want Israel destroyed and to go away, but in BDS it's just we have a more limited agenda, it's, you know, I remember from my student radical days, it really helps you to build a movement or an organization if you have a doable project that you can get people involved, and particularly young people, when they want to join a cause, want to have an action project, something they can do. And this is a very concrete one. You can petition or sit in or demonstrate or picket or whatever for these concrete demands, divest from Israel or boycott Israel. And the most striking thing about it is the spectacular hypocrisy of this movement, because you have educational institutions and some academic associations that have voted for academic boycotts of Israel, which have never voted for, and to my knowledge, even ever debated or considered academic boycott of countries where there's no academic freedom. There were British universities doing this that had close partner relations with universities in China that were run by the Chinese military. They never, and the same is true for the churches that have voted to divest, but they've never divested from countries which suppress the church or don't allow any freedom of religion. But so it's wildly hypocritical, or at least double standard is being applied, but it's an effective tactic.
So when you see that sort of hypocrisy, one of the explanations or one of the interpretations of that hypocrisy is to see it as a species of anti-Semitism. I know, and it's not my fault. My microphone is dying.
I can repeat the question.
Yeah, it's a species of anti-Semitism. Louise, could you ask Rigo to get me another microphone, please? Another microphone. Yeah. Is that one working? So, let me use this one. Yeah. Thank you. This one work? Yes. Good. I'm sorry. Thanks, David. So one of the explanations or interpretations of that hypocrisy is that at heart, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. That if you choose to boycott one country in the world, and that's the one country in the world that's a Jewish state, your deeper motivation is not that you're trying to seek social justice. Your deeper motivation is to destroy the Jewish people. Do you agree with that perception?
I don't, because it's hard to know what people's deeper motivations are. And so I'd much rather say to them, to paraphrase Lawrence Summers, who was the former president of Harvard and also served in government in various high capacities, that it's anti-Semitic in effect, even if not in intent. I don't know what not you, but you BDS, I don't know what your deeper motivation is, but I know that if you treat Israel according to one standard and all the other countries of the world by another standard, then in effect what you're doing is anti-Semitic. Maybe you didn't start out to think of yourself as someone who hated Jews, but that's all right. I'll believe you about that, but that's kind of beside the point, because what are the effects of your actions?
So let's. There's a fascinating case study of this, which I know you discuss in your book at length, which is worth taking a peek at, just so I can introduce it, so you'll read the book. A terrible tragedy took place in the year 2003. It's a young woman named Rachel Corrie, who was a student in Evergreen State University in Washington, who went to Israel, to the West Bank specifically, on behest of an organization called the International Solidarity Movement. And she was protesting the Israeli government's move to destroy a home. And you remember this story? So she stood in front of an Israeli army bulldozer, and she was waving her hands, trying to get the bulldozer driver to stop. That was her demonstration, and the driver later claimed he couldn't see her and ran her over, and she died. She was crushed to death. Terrible tragedy, a child dies. But of course, she becomes an emblem of something, a symbol of the cruelty of the Israelis, a symbol of the brutality of Israeli military. They even sued the Caterpillar company for creating the bulldozer that killed her. It's an emblem, but it's an interesting emblem on every level. So when you read that story, especially from the perspective we're talking about, what's the lesson of that story? How does an American kid end up in Israel standing in front of a bulldozer? And where did she get this idea that this is something that one would do on behalf of social justice?
Right. Well, it was in Gaza, and not the West Bank, and to my memory, they weren't actually destroying a house, but they were trying to level ground from which Palestinian fighters were shooting at them to get rid of the protective cover that was there. But it is this is a girl who grew up in Washington State, who wrote poems when she was 10 or 12 about how she tried to, walk through the woods and avoid stepping on any flower. She was a great, a delicate child, an idealist, and she wanted to be on the side of good and of the oppressed, and so on. And then she was radicalized at college. Now, this college she went to, Evergreen State, is there's a lot of leftism on college campuses, but Evergreen State is off the charts. They call actually the students call the quad in the center of campus, they call it Red Square at Evergreen State, and they have a very strong identity with the most radical causes. They've had, year after year, their commencement speaker has been someone in jail for murdering a policeman or something of that kind. And she got caught up in this ultra-radical spirit and way of thought, which in this day and age often chooses Israel and the Palestinians as the symbolic conflict of the whole world, of the forces of light versus the forces of darkness. And she also, in that, making that association, was encouraged by a very, very far left Israeli who was there at Evergreen. And there is in Israel a left fringe that really is against Israel, denies the legitimacy of the state, and it's just a fringe. I'm not even. I mean, there's a bigger left in Israel that's very critical of the current government, but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about this fringe, where the fringe involves a couple thousand people, Israelis, who are really against their own country, just as we often see on the very far left fringe Americans who are against their own country. It's very analogous, and think it's a capitalist, imperialist. We've heard that rhetoric, and there's some Israelis like that. And this Rachel Corrie also sort of came under the tutelage of I think it was a woman faculty member who was one of these extremist Israelis who encouraged her to believe that Israel was the symbol of all evil in the world. And this poor girl went and did, which she didn't know what she was doing really, because she was really carrying out a kind of military function, that is to prevent the IDF from leveling the ground from which it was being shot at. But even so, all the evidence showed that the bulldozer driver didn't know she was there, wasn't trying to kill her. It just was, the bulldozers are armored bulldozers. They have a metal mesh to protect the cab of the bulldozer from being taken out by gunfire or shrapnel, and so they give the driver very limited visibility.
So let's turn to. Whoops! I get this problem. Now this mic is off now. Did you switch mics on me? Can I have the other mic? Yeah. I have no mic here.
Hello?
You cast it. So take this one. So let's move to Israel for a second. And the simple question is, Israel's a very powerful country in many ways, in technology, in medicine, in culture, and a very adept people. Why have they been so powerless to reverse this demonization around the world, and particularly here in America?
Well, Rabbi, it's not fair to say they've been powerless here in America, because if we're focusing on the college campuses, the situation is quite dire from Israel's point of view. But if we're talking about the American public as a whole, we still have poll after poll showing that the American people are very staunchly supportive of Israel. I don't think that's true probably in any other country. Israel hasn't really lost out in terms of public opinion in America, although it has to a great extent in terms of elite opinion. Is what you're describing on the campuses is not only what students encounter from other students, but it's the attitude of faculty members, and it's also the attitude of much of the news media and much of the entertainment media, and so there's a kind of bifurcation between mass public opinion and elite public opinion, at least part of the elite. But around the world, it's very discouraging. And why has Israel been so helpless against this? I don't really understand myself why it hasn't done a better job. I think there, to some extent, there's a history of an attitude in Israel that they're against us anyway, so why bother? We don't really, let them say what they want, but we're still going to be here, and so that the battle for public opinion hasn't been waged very effectively. I think there have been some Israeli ambassadors in the U.S. who have been good, effective spokesmen for Israel. I don't know. I don't really know about the performance of Israeli ambassadors elsewhere. In some countries, I don't even know if the Israeli ambassadors can get on the television to give their side of the story. The bias against is so strong. But I'm afraid I can't give you a very satisfactory answer to this question.
Well, we're going to in a couple of months, we're actually going to have the Consul General. There's a new Consul General here in Los Angeles, and we're going to ask him this question, because one of the things that concerns me is that if Israel depends upon a strategic alliance with the United States, then the quality of American public opinion toward Israel is a strategic question for the state of Israel's future. And if you have a younger population that's been influenced on these college campuses and is now coming of age politically in America, that is a concerning factor. If I were the Prime Minister of Israel, I would worry that this memorandum of understanding we just signed is a 10-year deal. In 10 years, is there going to be another one? Or is in 10 years the change of opinion going to take hold and you're going to have a serious issue? So this becomes an issue. So I have one more question, and then I'm going to let you ask some questions. And I would be remiss if I didn't ask this question. And I don't know exactly how to phrase it, so I'm going to ask it bluntly, and you can answer it in any way you want. Trump. Trump and Israel. Trump and the Middle East. Trump and American foreign policy. Trump and the world. Trump. That's all I'm going to ask you. What do you think? You sort of know what I mean, right?
Well,
from where you sit, how worried should we be? What should we be looking for to know how worried we should be?
I think I'll tell you so people can know where I'm coming from. I more often have voted for the Republican than the Democrat. I voted for Hillary Clinton in this election because I found Trump to be just astoundingly ignorant, obnoxious, crude. So that's sort of my background, so you can know how to, or have a context for interpreting what I'm going to say. Which he will certainly be friendly to Israel. That's not something I worry about. But that's not enough. What I worry a great deal about is his infatuation with Putin and his ideas about Russia, because I don't really understand where it comes from, but he's paid a political price for it already, but he wouldn't back down from it throughout the campaign. And it just, the day after he was elected, he announced that he had gotten a very beautiful letter from Putin, and they've continued to make noises about how there's going to be a new relationship with Russia, and we're going to work together with Russia and Syria. There are many worrisome things about this. The first is, Russia doesn't want an alliance with the United States. Russia wants to as far as it can, restore its position when it was the Soviet Union of being a superpower or a world power, meaning necessarily at the expense of the United States. I think that Putin is clearly ready to flatter Trump and to try to use him. And I don't have the sense that Trump has any real opinions about any political issue. He seems to be so wrapped up in narcissism. That is, it's all about himself and what a figure he is. And the positions on issues seem to be impossible to decipher or self-contradictory. And I think that Putin, who is a very serious strategic thinker, is going to play him. And that worries me in many ways, but two immediate ones are, in terms of Israel and the Middle East, Putin has a strategic alliance with Iran. That's his partner. And Trump is saying, well, now we'll join the Putin-Assad alliance as the tail to their kite. But clearly the biggest threat that Israel faces now or for the coming decade or decades is from Iran, which is, unless it's stopped, will become a nuclear weapons state. And Trump may, without even knowing what he's doing, facilitate the rising strength of this Russia-Iran axis. The other thing that worries me, I've been worried about it under President Obama because of his great reluctance to project force abroad, but I think my worry redoubles with Trump, and that is the cornerstone of U.S. security since World War II has been NATO. And I would argue that that's been really the cornerstone of world peace, or as much peace as we've had in the world. But we haven't had another world war after I and II. And when they were invented, we had hoped that the UN would be the instrument that would keep peace in the world, and that proved to be a vain hope. The UN's been very ineffective. But NATO, as the mightiest alliance in the world, has kept the world relatively peaceful. But if Russian forces would march into, they wouldn't march in, they would go in disguise, as they did in Ukraine, into Estonia, which has a large Russian population, which could complain like the people in eastern Ukraine complained that they were disfranchised and discriminated against. If Russia goes into Estonia, Estonia is now a member of NATO. If NATO doesn't militarily rise to the defense of Estonia, then NATO is finished. then everyone will understand that that guarantee in the NATO treaty is worthless. And because Obama has been so reluctant to use American force, I've been afraid that Putin would do something like that under Obama, and he hasn't. But Trump, well, may at the end of the day be more willing to use force somewhere than Obama, but he has this soft spot in his heart for Putin, and if he would let, as I fear he would, let Putin get away with that, because Putin could do a lot in Estonia in a very short time before people were able to sit Trump down and try to make him understand what this means. We could have the end of NATO, and that would make the whole world a much less safe and stable place.
A lot of questions. We have a few minutes for some questions, so we're not going to get everybody's. We'll get a few. And I just, as I always do with due respect to the community, want to remind you that the purpose of a question is to get our speaker to answer. So please keep your question to one sentence. It starts with the words what, when, where, why, and how, and it ends with a question mark so that we can hear our speaker. Okay, please, you have the first one. You're going to have to use this one because this is the only mic that's working.
I'll talk very loud.
No. Use
Can you hear me?
No, it doesn't work. I'm telling you, it's not working. Use this mic. He switched them, so this one works, that one doesn't. That's an electric lollipop.
He just set it up. He told me it
He
worked.
set that one up. You didn't set this one up. I'm telling you.
The first question relates to the first
Just
part
one
of your
question,
talk.
because we'd have a lot of people want to ask, okay?
Real quick one. sorry.
One question.
Okay. When I talk to young people, they say that even when they grew up in pro-Israel houses, that the problem is the settlements and Netanyahu's right-wing government. Do you think that these are really irrelevant issues?
So the question was,
about
young
the- people
people say the problem is really Netanyahu and the settlements and the right-wing government in Israel. For Israel's image, sure, those are problems. And in my opinion, the settlements are not a good thing. They're a bad thing, and or at least the big majority of them are. And the government of Israel takes some positions on some on issues that are more hard-line than I wish it was. But at the end of the day, a great deal of this is changeable if the Palestinians will make peace. If they will come and sit in negotiations and say, we will give up the so-called right of return. We will recognize Israel as the Jewish state, or the state of the Jewish people, or however, and agree to live side by side with you in peace forever. If you evacuate 3/4 of the settlements and give us territory and let us have a capital in East Jerusalem, is a clear majority of Israelis who would support that. So there is actually a path by which the Palestinians could get rid of a large share of the settlements, but that they spurn that because they're not interested in making peace. So is Netanyahu and the settlements a problem for us who are advocates for Israel? Yes, it is. But is that what's standing in the way of peace? I don't believe so.
I apologize. Does someone have a blue Lexus with the license plate 6UFK 662? If you do, we need you just to come outside for a second, please. A blue Lexus. Did you hear me? No microphone.
There's a blue Lexus that needs to be moved.
Would you like one? Do I hear $1,000 for the blue Lexus?
No,
Not here. Look, that's down the hall. Okay, Pop, you got the next question?
Why is it the further one is from one's Jewish roots, the less Israel means to them, to the point where they're willing to accept the Goebbels-generated lies about Israel and even mouth off against it, even when these lies are refutable?
Okay.
You know, it's I think there is a reason for it, and the reason is, you know, someone said, I guess probably in the aftermath of the Six-Day War, that Israel had become the religion of American Jews, but I think really the American Jews have three. There's some part of American Jews for whom Judaism is their religion. There's some part for whom Israel is, that they're secular, they're non-observant, but their identity with Israel defines their Jewish identity. And then there's a third part for whom leftism defines their, as they see it, their Jewish identity. And they say, well, I'm Jewish because I believe in these Jewish values which are expressed in this political ideology. And as I alluded to before, not always, but in this era, leftism is very anti-Israel, and so for those Jews whose sense of their their self-identity is mostly in terms of political ideology, they're often willing to embrace the anti-Israel positions.
Good. Who has the mic? Douglas.
Hi. What role do you think the New York Times has in all of this? And do you think Trump has been fair in his criticism of the Gray Lady?
I can't speak to Trump's criticisms, but the New York Times is tremendously influential. It always was a little bit self-conscious about being a Jewish-owned newspaper, but still, it had a history in some periods of being very fair to Israel and balanced in its Middle East coverage. I happened to have been commissioned to do a study back in the early 1980s of the news media in Israel, and I found the New York Times was the most fair, objective, and balanced compared to the television networks, the Washington Post, the Time and Newsweek. But I think the New York Times has also been caught up in this ideological wave that I've alluded to. When I get 3 papers in the morning, Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, I look at the New York Times, it seemed to me over the last 10 years or so, or from the time of the editorship of Bill Keller, that the Times sort of consciously is not seeking balance, but is seeking to convey a liberal view of the world, which is reflected in the choice of stories it puts on the front page and what it devotes resources to. And I think that ideological slant is what accounts for the Times having tilted toward much less friendly stance toward Israel, and on the whole, less of a devotion to journalistic neutrality, which is something that I cherish and used to be the trademark of the New York Times.
Thanks. Who has the mic?
I'm sorry,
Please.
I'll have to just try once more. I might have not described it properly. It might be a baby blue color Lexus, and it wasn't B, it was B6B. And it's got a UCLA license plate frame on the front. So if that sounds familiar, come see me, please.
Your baby's locked in the back seat. And, I'm sorry, that was cruel. There's $100 million in the trunk, if anyone... Please.
what is your opinion of the schism between the Shias and the Sunnis and how that will affect Israel? It's beginning to affect Israel now with the military becoming more closer to like Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. And how will that affect the Palestinians with Gaza being Iran and the West Bank being more, more closer to the Sunnis?
Well, it's a very hopeful development, although I think it may not be permanent. But right now, the whole band of Sunni states, led by Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, and the other Gulf states, feels itself very much threatened by a kind of offensive by Shiites, as they see it, which really is Iran, which is the center of the Shiite world, and that contest, or that competition is very severe, and it has led to a new openness to Israel on the part of the Sunnis, not to the point in which they're ready to step up and sign peace treaties, but they have let some of this be public. There was a public meeting in New York of Dory Gold with General Anwar Eshki, who's very close to the royal family, and there's clearly some talk of military cooperation. Some of the Gulf states are renewing or increasing economic relations with Israel, and people who are skeptics say, well, that's fine, but these winds could shift again, and these we don't think there's very deep acceptance of Israel going on. But I'm a little more hopeful than that. I don't know how deep the acceptance of Israel is in Egypt, but we've had that peace treaty for 40 years, and it was not even disrupted by the Muslim Brotherhood government when they came to power, although if they had been able to stay in power for a decade, they might well have done something. But I at least have the hope that there could be some peace treaties, or if not peace treaties, warmer relations with some of the Sunni states, including, perhaps most importantly, with Saudi Arabia, which is a big player and was historically so much of the engine room of hatred of Israel and of Jews. But there's been a significant change, at least among the leadership levels in Saudi Arabia. The hope that one has is that if this alliance and these relationships with the Sunnis continues, deepens, that this could be a source of pressure on the Palestinians, who are part of the Sunni world. Yes, there's some of the Palestinians in Gaza and Hamas are aligned with Iran, but there are no Shiite Palestinians. They're all Sunnis. That this could be a way to push the Palestinians toward being willing to make peace. The other Sunnis, I think, would like to see that happen, because they feel that it's a drain on their resources and a constraint on their diplomacy to always have to be championing the hopeless Palestinian cause. And I think they would be ready to normalize relations with Israel if there was any kind of Israel-Palestinian agreement. I mean, they said that in the in the so-called Saudi peace plan of already 15 years back.
Brian, I think you have the microphone? You have the
Yeah,
last question.
yeah.
It'll be the last question tonight. Go ahead.
Referencing that college student that the first questioner brought up, assuming that student takes their Judaism seriously, has a love of the state of Israel, and yet is troubled by some of the actions of the current government, what would you consider an acceptable form of peaceful protest?
Peaceful protest of the actions of the Israeli government. Write a letter. It seems to me a little strained to say, okay, I'm an American Jew, I support Israel, but I don't like some of the policies of the Israeli government, and therefore I have to protest them. I would be curious to know what other things this individual feels. What other events in the world this student feels constrained to protest. It almost sort of smacks to me of a kind of vanity that, well, yes, I'm a Jew who's pro-Israel, but I want everyone to know that I dissociate myself from some things that Israel does that that aren't to my liking of somebody else's. I mean, why?
Well, but if I see Israel and I think that the policies of the government are self-destructive and are following a pathway that may be adopting an agenda that's acceptable to certain factions in Israel, but I don't think that's, neither is it just nor is it in the end productive. For example, for settlements to expand on the West Bank, for Israeli Arabs to be forced to sign loyalty oaths, to further disenfranchise non-Orthodox Jews. And I want to say, look, I love Israel enough. I want it to be my Israel too.
Well,
You really don't see that as a line as an expression of loyalty to the ideals of Israel?
As I look at it, Rabbi, I'm a Jew. I could, up until now, have at any moment in my life, and I still could, make Aliyah. And under the law of the return, I would become an Israeli. And then I would become immediately an Israeli voter. And I would be part of the democratic process in Israel of shaping policy. And I could not only vote, I could protest and do other things. As an American Jew who supports Israel, I don't feel it's very appropriate or becoming to me to have strong opinions about what Israel ought to do. Except at the point in which we were to reach some extreme, and Israel was doing some egregious human rights violations of a kind that I would protest by another government elsewhere. But I don't feel otherwise that I have sort of a special standing to publicly denounce or protest things that Israel does, because I'm a Jew, that I wouldn't protest if any other government did it.
Okay, well, I appreciate that, and we're gonna hear that debated in future sessions of our conversation. Before we finish tonight, I want to urge you to pick up a copy of the book. It's called How Making David into Goliath, How the World Turned Against Israel. We want to thank Dr. Joshua Moravchik as our guest tonight. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you to Louise and to Alana for their help tonight, and to Doug